stay with the stuff because you're going to eat it all during the winter, right? Another thing happened is that you had property. It used to be prior to that, people only had as much property as they could carry around in their back. But then there got to be a different kind of property that you didn't have to, that you couldn't carry, and this was a fundamental change in the society. It leads to inequality. It means that the guy with the biggest stick puts together a gang, and he decides that you don't own that land, that you can have enough to eat, but the rest you give to him. And it's the beginning of the hierarchy of society. Agriculture is the beginning of the hierarchical society, okay? Does that all make sense to you?
Yeah.
Tough guys, beat up the other guys, make them work for them. It leads ultimately to kings and peasants, which is the longest term, the way that civilization has run, okay? And they start making laws, and the laws are always to benefit the kings, by the way, and to keep order. I mean, he wants order because it works for him, right? And he doesn't care if the order means that you stay down there, but he starts caring about your life because he gets stuff from you. You know, he gets stuff from you. So the laws try to set an order that's not too exploitative. In the beginning, they would just beat you up until you do, and they would come back and beat you every once in a while just to make sure. But they found laws and structures, and this is the beginning of that structure that we're talking about. Is that you start to believe in the laws, what they say. You start thinking, oh yeah, he's better than me. That's why he's up there. The divine right of kings. He's a god. In fact, the pharaohs were part of his gods, and they did an awful lot because that supported the structure, which was mental, but also economic, also social, okay? So, and the other thing about it is that when you have a surplus, that means not everybody has to be planting all the time. Some people can start making art. And so, Egypt, they start making pyramids, they start making buildings, statues, painting, languages, all this kind of stuff. It's all because not everybody has to be planting all the time. Where it used to be they had to be hunting and gathering, no one had much time to do anything else. And they're moving around so they couldn't. But once you have this stable thing, then you get that, okay? Now, it's interesting to point out, by the way, that the level of civilization attained by the pharaohs didn't happen in Europe until about here. Europe was, except for Greece and Rome and around the Mediterranean basin, and they survived on travel and trade and imperialism. And that's 2,500 years ago, okay? Greece and Rome, they also invented the idea of a republic. So a number of little sparks happened that die away pretty fast. In Rome, the republic was a fairly short period of time, then they became an empire with a Caesar, okay? In Greece, it was a few hundred years, and then more or less they became kings again, and they started kicking each other's butts.
What was science like in ancient Egypt or like before?
It was a collection of folk remedies. Science doesn't really start till Greece. Science is different than technology. Agriculture, all that stuff, language, even laws are kinds of technologies. Okay, they're technologies. Science is a kind of technology that works towards the general law so that you can pull new technologies out of. It's working toward, it's called inductive as opposed to deductive. It's inductive and it creates general rules that are abstract, that aren't necessarily practical, but within those understandings you can pull out. I mean, some of what they did was, like geometry is a kind of a technology too, and science is a kind of technology, but we're thinking of it as kind of a separate thing, because it actually has a very special place. Science is a very special place in human culture. Okay. Anyway, so they go back to kings and peasants, and then we have the Dark Ages. We're not going to talk too much about them right now, but not much else. So in Europe, there was always the Dark Ages. Rome came through there for a while, and they had a little bit of civilization there, but they couldn't hold it together for very long, and the barbarians they moved back, right? And so Europe, all this time, never was up to the level of the civilization that the Middle East is during their, they were for thousands of years. dynasties and dynasties. They had, and the reason for that is technological. The reason for that is that the flood basins, and by the way, they also had that level of civilization in the Ganges and in certain areas of China. It's all having to do with river basins. And having a reliable flood and ebb, so that they could actually having a reliable growing situation and then the storage situation, and then we knew it was going to come back again, and so that's how they built this civilization. In Europe, they could never plant that much because they didn't have those flood and climate things, and they didn't have a plow that would actually cut into the hard soil. They finally did around 1300. And that's when the beginning of the rebirth, they call it the Renaissance, but for Europe, in fact, it was the beginning. Okay, but in Europe then we had this big technological explosion that led to the Age of Exploration, where they had more colonialism and imperialism. Then there's the Age of Enlightenment, which is this thing where they start thinking about stuff, and where the Age of Reason begins, and individualism and the scientific method. And then the big change for us is during the 1800s with the Industrial Revolution, because that's when the middle class starts. And that changes a lot of things. It changes a lot of things about art, it changes a lot of things about life and consumerism, and it's all about the extra surplus. Agriculture is the first surplus, the second surplus comes from the Industrial Revolution. In between, not much change in that way, okay? Although there was a spurt because of the invention of the metal plow and horse-drawn plow. The oxen and the push stick couldn't do it in Europe, so there was this, they never could grow their civilization that more than just having these little forts with barons in them and riding out, killing each other and going back. The feudal system was basically a beaten down or undeveloped version of the Egyptian kings things, but never flowered like that they did, because they didn't have the economic ability. And it was all about a relationship with technology and environment. Okay, so technology is a super big thing. That's only the first slide. Okay, cool move. Anyway, back to this here, right in here, we're going to talk about the beginning of the modern era. This happens right after that plow invention in Europe, where we emerge from the Dark Ages, and it's called the Renaissance. And that was, when they talk about Renaissance, they're talking about looking back to the Greece and Rome that they remembered. They didn't remember it very well, because in fact they had been slowly discovering it. Most of it had been saved by the Arabs, because the Library of Alexandria had burned down. But slowly they started pulling these ideas back into European culture, even though most of Europe didn't really have that much. And they got it from Cordoba, the library in Toledo in Cordoba. The Jews translated from Arabic for the Christians during the recapturing of Spain. It was an amazing story, really good story. Anyway, so classical thought reboots science and this idea of humanism. So what is humanism? It means, it has a lot to do with the proper study of man is mankind. The proper study of mankind is man. And that you can look around, you can observe, you can make choices. Because all during the Dark Ages, it was all about scriptural authority.
God.
And that it was a hierarchy that was set up by gods, and you didn't, no matter if they said that's red and it looked blue to you, you still said it was red, okay? And you started to believe it was red, okay? So when they started looking around with this new technology and started spotting planets and things like that, and started thinking that the world was not the center of the universe and that things are different, this was would never have happened during the period of authority, but things changed because they started to develop an agricultural surplus because of that plow, and because they started looking back at the texts that they were pulling in from the Greeks that had been saved by the Arabs. They started having this thing, and right about that time is when they sailed to America, because they had increased their technology 100 years later, they sail to discover America, and that's the age of exploration. And the main thing that happens during that period of time is colonialism and imperialism, and they started using other people's money. And so they're back to the Roman model of like going and taking stuff. And Europe grows, really grows fast and big. And they have this extra leisure, and they start thinking about stuff, and that's when the age of reason happens, okay? And reason and individualism happens, and that's when they start thinking about things like democracy. Start going back, like, I'm an individual. I'm not just in a hierarchy with God. I'm an individual, okay? And that turns out to be a super big idea. You ever see this painting before?
No.
You never have seen this painting?
I've seen it. It actually happened, right? Well, supposedly.
Okay. All right. So this is a painting by a guy named David. He didn't pronounce his name that way. They called him Jacques-Louis David. Okay, and he was a painter in France. And he actually did a lot of painting down in Rome. And this guy, Marat, was one of the leaders of the French Revolution, sort of midway through it, and he got assassinated. And this was a painting that David did of Marat, okay? And I thought you'd all know this one. Okay. You're not going to know this one. Well, this one changed the world. This one you've seen. This one you've seen. Okay.
About three brothers, and they're going to war.
Okay, so this is Jacques-Louis David, and he went down. So what's happening in Europe is the age of reason and the age of individualism, and they're starting to think about democracy. And America's starting to think about democracy and these republics, and they're all starting to break away from this idea of the ancient regimes. And Jacques-Louis David goes down and he paints this story about the people rising up and supporting an idea. And this painting is credited with rabble-rousing people from the French Revolution. It was a big propaganda thing about stand together, we'll fight for our rights and for our honor. Okay? And at the same time, he did this one, which is that more or less, we'll die for truth. This is Socrates, right? Same artist. How he's going to take the cup because he won't give in. They're both narratives, okay? They're both narratives, and they're both doing the kind of thing that art has always done for the establishment, which is support the church or the state and tell the stories that they want to make them look good. But these were actually turned against the state. They were in support of the new budding revolution, of the French Revolution. Okay? And so this actually became art jumping into the fray and standing up for the people, carrying the idea forward. Okay? And that's what's happening. Yes?
What sort of venues were these to stay in?
They had social, I don't actually know, but they had big pavilions and rich people would show stuff, and they had, I mean, the art world in France was a very developed kind of elite thing, like going to the opera. You know, people would go to these things and see this stuff. And they would cause quite a stir. Now, the peasants wouldn't see these paintings, but it's the middle class that sees these paintings. And the middle class, of course, are the people who more or less get the peasants to support them in a revolution against the king. The king. And this, by the way, you can't have a revolution until you have enough middle class people to be able to offer something in opposition to the king. Peasants and slaves don't ever have successful revolutions. It's always the middle class that does. The Russian Revolution may be an exception to that, because it didn't go according to plan. But it was weird, because they did have a I mean, the people that ran that revolution were intellectuals that were living outside of, you know. So you need kind of this middle class to stand against the upper class for a revolution to happen. And so this was a really for them. So they had the revolution, you know, liberté, fraternité, égalité. It's all about individualism, okay? And a new order is formed, but it's not so different than the old order. So, in fact, they even invite some kings back. First they have Napoleon, and they didn't go very well with Napoleon in the end. He actually did a lot of stuff. He carries all these ideas out to the rest of Europe, and they come to fruition about 50 years later. But it's not. But France goes through some really hard times, and they have such a bad time. They invite kings back. They had 2 more kings after they cut off Louis XVI's head. They brought 2 more back. One of them they didn't like too much. They tried another one. Okay, for the next 50 years, well, it's actually really another 30 years. I think it was 1812 till 1848. They have 2 kings, Louis Philippe and Charles, I think. Okay, and they try to go back to the old way.
So did they?
And the old way had very specific ways of doing things. Okay, and they had a lot of rules about how painting should be done. And these paintings were painted for the aristocracy. It's an academic painting, but they had different kinds. They did have some paintings. They were portraits. They had landscapes, and they had historical paintings, and then they had these kind of subjects that were mythological. And they all are supposed to follow certain kind of rules because it's a very structured society. There's a lot of propriety involved. Okay, so the large canvases were supposed to be historical, and you know, so they would make paintings like this with. She stands for France. She's an allegorical figure, and these are the soldiers who've given their lives to the revolution, but they're still fighting, and they're going to keep fighting, and it's big historical. And you know, this is again going back to that same model, right, of artists for the church or the state. It's just a different state. You know, this is the revolutionary state as opposed to the set state. Although by that time, they brought back these kings when this painting was painted. But the whole point is that it's big. And it's supposed to be big, and all the big paintings are for these epic subjects. There's an artist named Gustave Courbet, and he paints this painting. And it's big. And it becomes a revolution in itself. And this is about 1848. And during that time, there was revolutions happening all over Europe, in almost every country. And then France, you know, they talk about the barricades in the streets where they piled in all the fine throwing stones. So in 50 countries, and it's amazing that Americans don't know this, but there were revolutions all over the world in 1848. It was the reason why suddenly all the German immigrants started coming, which is the largest wave of immigration the United States ever had. All these revolutions were by the peasants and they failed. But at the same time, Gustave Courbet paints this, and he says, art shouldn't be historical, it shouldn't be mythological, it should be real. I'm talking about real life, about real people. That's what art should be like. And he is the beginning of the avant-garde. Most people consider him the avant-garde. What he did was, there was a big exposition universelle, you know, that French would have these big shows, not like just the Salon, but this was bigger, Industrial Revolution kind of thing, right? And it would be all the paint, it would be like this year's model for everything they're going to put in there. And all the best painters get to it, right? The Universal Exposition of Painting. And they didn't want to show this big one because they were offended by it because it broke the rules. So what he did was he rented a piece of property across the street and set up a big tent, okay, called the Pavilion of Realism, and started showing his paintings there. And that is what I would call the avant-garde strategy. Just say, they're wrong and we're right. This is it. Turn over the table. Okay? So that was the beginning of the avant-garde. And I told you about the year of revolutions. A lot of stuff is going on during this period of time. For the next 50 years in Europe, there's the Industrial Revolution is really picking up steam. This is when you have Dickens writing all his novels about people living in poverty and coal dust breathing, and they're all dying, and they're all suffering poverty, orphans. And the social theorists start to take on this problem, people like Karl Marx. And they start coming up with new ideas how we can change society. But this is all coming out of that idea of rationalism and individualism. Starting to look to how the people are instead of how the structure from the top down is trying to look at the people, right? And to get the artists on their side, a social theorist once said, oh, you guys are the avant-garde for us. You are leading the way. And Gustave Courbet, he took that to heart. He got involved in lots of these Paris Commune. The Paris Commune is a famous time they tried to turn into a kind of a socialist, took over Paris apart from the rest of France. And he was out there tearing down statues and stuff like that, the way we do when we go to invade Iraq. Anyway, it's pretty interesting. He had to run out and leave France. It's a pretty good story. But the main thing that was happening is that while we're having an avant-garde starting, is we're also having a new social structure. And it has to do with the real big growth of a new middle class. It's not just the high-end merchants that were competing with the king that decided, you know, that we should have things be a little different instead of you guys, U.S. aristocracy all the time, should be a little bit about us. Now there's a new middle class that are the bourgeois and the petit bourgeois, okay?
Petit bourgeois?
The petit bourgeois. The petit bourgeois. And it's because there's this surplus. There's people have a little bit extra money, and they have a little bit extra time. So a lot of things start happening. You have bohemians that can sort of get by on the fat of the land, you know, or take the scraps. So you have this Paris situation where you have these middle class people, there's bohemians, and people have weekends, and there's more and more artists happening because there's more chances and more people to sell. I mean, because the idea of an oil-painted canvas is only a couple hundred years old. It starts in the 1600s in Holland, and it's like this portable commodity. Prior to that, things were so big that you had to be either the church or state owner. But then when you start making small little things like oil paintings that you can carry around, middle class starts to buy it. They want it to be cool too. They also have these salons, the Salon des Refuses. And the Salon des Refuses is because there's other things that are happening. The technology is changing, the views are changing, okay? And by the way, the Salons des Refuses were paid for by Napoleon III.
What's Salon des Refuses?
The people who've been refused have their own salon.
Why did you?
So that's where the Impressionists started off.
Right.
Because they wouldn't let them in, because they were still a pretty conservative market. They kind of let in Courbet, but his work looks pretty conservative, doesn't it? I mean, it doesn't look that wild, right?
But it's about the people.
But it's about the people, which was a revolutionary idea. Okay, so this is what happens in the Salon des Refuses. But what is this about? It's about the people, but these people are not peasants sitting around. These guys are having leisure time. So this becomes a big deal, okay? But it's also about formalism. And this is the new thing that happens here. And we're going to have an interesting idea here, okay? Formalism happens in painting, which is getting interested in painting, about the techniques and the different ideas of paintings, okay?
Like it's not about the image, it's about the way it's painted.
It's about the way it's painted. And so you have like a dichotomy. And the dichotomy is the art for art's sake, which is people who are, it's about aesthetics and pleasure and fascination, you know, and then you have the side that's about content. It's about form, this is kind of like form versus content, okay? And it's about the meanings. And this is often referred to as the art into life idea. And that will make more sense in a little while. But it addresses life and the real world, people, politics, and their lives, okay? And this is really about a kind of a pleasure and beauty of things, right? And then comes World War I. And then comes World War I, which was a real drag. And it was so much of a drag that it changed. Everybody thought the future was getting nicer. People had nicer clothes. People had more money. They were, not everybody. But there was always poor people. There was probably more poor people than ever. But there was also a lot more people that had a lot more free time. And that's actually almost the way it always works. The way that you make people poorer is to give their money to the middle class. It's really more like the middle class takes it using a structure to set up by the larger social structure. So you always get more people when you get more rich people. Anyway, so this was a big deal to the artists at the time. Because no one had this was unlike war had ever been before. It lasted for a long time. It wasn't just seasonal. Wars used to be just like it would happen in the summer and everybody go home, come back and do it again. This was like trenches and people, this was like twice as many people died in this war than died in World War II. And people were really upset about what they were seeing. Like I'm just going to make and people losing arms, legs, they were kept alive. It used to be they would die automatically. And then they're coming back and society is seeing all these war refugees like this. Okay? You don't need to see much of that stuff, but it's really gross. I mean, people were in all these explosions, things they'd never seen before. And then these guys who were hiding out in Switzerland, because Switzerland was not fighting, started something called the Cabaret Voltaire. Have you heard about it? The Cabaret Voltaire? Okay, this is where Dada started. Dada is the original historical avant-garde. We have the avant-garde idea, which I would point to Gustave Courbet and a lot of people after him. He starts an idea, but it's not what we call the historical avant-garde. It's something that sets aside, but has a relationship to Courbet. So this is the beginning of Dada. What's the main idea of Dada? A lot of people say, well, it's kind of absurd, this weird, absurd stuff that they did. The main idea about Dada, and it's talked about in the institutional critique thing, is that its idea was the world has gone so bad, and artists and our institutions did not do anything to stop it. We have to destroy our institutions in order to move ahead. The idea of Dada was that we were going to tear down the sense-making structure that supports our art.
But it's like not anarchic for some reason, to me.
Well, it was kind of, they could do almost anything. They would get up.
Right, they could do anything they want.
So it was kind of anarchic.
You know,
What period was this?
Well, it starts in the second half of the World War I, so I would say 1917, 1916 in Switzerland, and moves to Paris and Berlin as soon as the war is over. This is actually in Berlin, and you have Hugo Ball, Jean Arp, you have Tristan Tzara. They inspire the Surrealists. Surrealists in France take up the idea of this kind of absurdity of modern culture.
When would you say was like the peak of surrealism? It was after Dada.
20s and 30s.
When?
The 20s was generally.
What about like the Gutai art movement?
That's post World War II Japan.
Okay, but that kind of seems a bit similar to this.
That's a neo-avant-garde.
There's too much stuff
Huh?
to remember.
Well, but I didn't mention Gutai. You mentioned Gutai.
I know, because I was just thinking it reminded me of that. But they're like all really similar in, well, they're not all
But
similar.
this, I mean, you don't really learn much. This, I'm just trying to give you a structure for art history. I don't need all the dates, but basically what it is here's the idea. Technology pushes our world into new ways, and we have to adapt, right? What happens eventually is that we have a culture that allows people like us to be, and we are offered two choices. One is to let it insulate and make us feel comfortable, or one is to take responsibility for it and worry about the problems that it's making, right? And that's what I'm offering you, and this is all to support that idea. And these guys said the way that we will address this problem, since we're artists, is we will attack art. We'll tear it down and build a new kind of art. But their idea was art has to be part of everybody's life. It's a way to express and share, okay? They did this in the Bauhaus, they did this in constructivism. This was taking all the ideas of making a brave new world. But the Dadaists never took it any further than really the idea of tearing things down. The Surrealists took it to the subconscious. That's what Surrealism was about. But it was all about this tearing down the social structures and speaking truth to power. But they didn't know what to say positive. They could only point to the stuff that was going wrong. They didn't really have an idea. So their idea was just say no and destroy the arts institutions. But the one positive idea they said was that art needs to be involved in all the things that involves people. It can't be just in an academy. It can't just be about what's nice. It has to actually address issues. Okay? The problem is that support for art comes from the power elite, and they support the status quo, and they're not going to help you carry your message, because your message is about messing with their livelihood and their status, okay? And the way that it works is that whenever you do something radical, the art institution of art aestheticizes it. So that you take something that's a Dada, I mean the urinal was a Dada thing, okay? The Duchamp's, that was his Dada gesture, to tear down, to lampoon the whole idea of this art show, to say it's ridiculous and that anything can be art, ready-mades.